League of Nations. After the First World War, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States proposed the creation of the League of Nations. It was an international organization meant to prevent future wars. The idea was part of his 14 points. It was a peace program that called for open diplomacy. It also called for the reduction of armaments and the right of peoples to self-determination. In 1919, Wilson went to the Paris Peace Conference, where he actively promoted this initiative. His plan was partly included in the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations was officially created. However, the main irony was that the United States, the initiator of the organization, did not join it. The American Senate refused to ratify the treaty, fearing that participation in the League would limit U.S. sovereignty and force the country to get involved in European conflicts. Wilson tried to convince Congress and led a campaign to support the treaty but failed. As a result, the League of Nations existed without the United States, which seriously weakened its authority and effectiveness. It could not respond effectively to the aggression of Italy, Japan, or Germany in the 1930s. Its inaction became one of the reasons why the world once again fell into war. After the Second World War, the League was dissolved and replaced by the United Nations, this time with the full participation of the United States. Vietnam War. After the Second World War, the United States became involved in a long and exhausting conflict in Vietnam. The main escalation began under the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 1960s. He decided to send large contingents of American troops after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. The event was presented as an attack by North Vietnamese forces on American ships, although later it became clear that the attack had been exaggerated or misinterpreted. Johnson and his advisors believed that stopping the spread of communism in Southeast Asia was vital to U.S. interests. They believed in the so-called domino theory. If Vietnam fell, other countries in the region would follow. For several years, America increased its military presence, sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and carried out massive bombings. But the war became increasingly unpopular among Americans. People began to question why their country was fighting on the other side of the world in a conflict that could not be won. Universities and cities were swept by anti-war protests. By the early 1970s, it became clear that the strategy had failed. In 1973, American troops left Vietnam, and 2 years later, the North captured Saigon. The war ended in defeat, leaving deep scars on American society. The Vietnam War changed the United States' perception of its own role in the world. It undermined trust in government-divided society and showed that even the most powerful army cannot always secure a political victory. Watergate Scandal. After his successful re-election in 1972, President Richard Nixon found himself at the center of a political scandal that became one of the most famous in the history of the United States. In June of that year, 5 men were arrested while trying to install listening devices in the headquarters of the Democratic Party at the Watergate Hotel in Washington. At first, the incident seemed like a minor crime, but over time it became clear that it was directly connected to the president's team. Journalists from the Washington Post began their own investigation. They discovered that behind it was a wide system of political espionage and cover-ups coordinated from the White House. The Nixon administration tried to deny involvement, but the evidence kept growing. The climax of the scandal came with the recordings of conversations from the presidential office. When Congress demanded their release, Nixon refused, citing national security. After long court proceedings, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered him to hand over the tapes. They contained statements proving that the president had personally tried to obstruct the investigation. Under pressure from the evidence and the threat of impeachment, Richard Nixon in August 1974 became the first president in the history of the United States to resign voluntarily. His departure marked the end of an era of trust in political power. Victory in the Persian Gulf. In 1991, President George Herbert Walker Bush announced the start of Operation Desert Storm, a military campaign against Iraq after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The international community supported the United States, and within a few weeks the Iraqi army was defeated. The coalition won, and Kuwait was liberated. It seemed like an example of a clean and quick war that showed the strength of the West. However, after the victory, Bush made a controversial decision not to go to Baghdad and not to remove Saddam Hussein from power. The president believed that this could cause chaos in the region, draw the United States into the occupation of Iraq, and split the international coalition. At that time, it seemed like a cautious and reasonable move, but the consequences turned out to be very different. Saddam remained in power, brutally suppressing the uprisings of Kurds and Shia that erupted after Iraq's defeat. His regime became even more repressive, and hatred toward the United States only grew. Iraq was never stabilized, and tension in the Middle East persisted for years. Many analysts later admitted that the unfinished war of 1991 created the conditions for a new crisis. Because Saddam's regime was not removed, then the United States 10 years later found itself drawn into Iraq again, this time under George Walker Bush. Great Depression. After the economic boom of the 1920s, the United States was filled with the belief that prosperity would last forever. Stock markets were growing, banks were freely issuing loans, and millions of Americans were buying stocks, hoping to get rich quickly. President Herbert Hoover, who was elected in 1928, believed in the power of the free market and minimal government intervention in the economy. But in the fall of 1929, the situation changed dramatically. In October, the stock market crashed, a day that went down in history as Black Thursday. Stock prices plummeted, investors lost everything, and banks began to go bankrupt. Within a few months, the economy of the country came to a halt. Hoover initially tried to reassure the public. He claimed that these were temporary difficulties and that the market would recover on its own. However, the reality was different. Companies closed, millions of people lost their jobs, and farmers lost their land. People lived in tents called Hoovervilles in protest against the president's inaction. Hoover's administration avoided direct social assistance programs, believing that they would make people dependent on the government. But the lack of decisive actions only worsened the situation. By 1932, unemployment reached 25%, and the country was in the deepest crisis of the 20th century. The Great Depression became a lesson that market self-regulation does not always work. After Hoover's defeat in the elections, the new president Franklin Roosevelt introduced the New Deal program, which provided jobs for millions of people and laid the foundation for modern social policy in the United States. Atomic bomb. In August 1945, President Harry Truman of the United States made a decision that became one of the most controversial in world history. After more than 4 years of bloodshed in the Second World War, the United States had created a new weapon, the atomic bomb. The war in Europe was already over, but Japan continued to resist, refusing to surrender. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The city was almost completely destroyed. 3 days later, on August 9th, the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. A few days later, Japan surrendered and the war ended. Many Americans at that time saw it as a necessary step that saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, since an invasion of the Japanese islands could have been even bloodier. But over time, doubts appeared. Some historians believe that the use of atomic weapons was a demonstration of power toward the Soviet Union rather than a military necessity. This decision changed the world forever. It began the nuclear era, a period of fear, an arms race, and political tension between superpowers. Truman justified his choice by saying that he acted for the sake of quickly ending the war. But the moral consequences of this step remain the subject of debate even today. The use of atomic weapons became a symbol of how technological progress can at the same time be both an achievement and a catastrophe for humanity. Reaganomics. In 1980, Ronald Reagan won the presidential election in the United States, promising to make America great again. His vision was based on lowering taxes, deregulating the economy, and reducing the role of the government in business. This policy was later called Reaganomics. Reagan believed that if taxes were reduced for large corporations and wealthy citizens, the money would trickle down to the middle class and workers, creating new jobs and economic growth. In the short term, this really worked. The economy revived, inflation fell, and production increased. Reagan became popular and a symbol of American optimism in the 1980s. However, behind the outward success, there were problems. Tax cuts for the rich led to a record budget deficit. The government began to borrow money actively, and the national debt of the United States doubled. Social programs were reduced while the gap between the rich and the poor continued to grow. The policy of deregulation, which Reagan saw as a step toward business freedom, created conditions for risky financial operations. As a result, this led to crises in the banking sector at the end of the 1980s and became one of the factors of future financial shocks in the 2000s. Reagan remained in the memory of Americans as a charismatic leader, but his economic strategy had mixed consequences. It gave short-term growth at the cost of increasing inequality and enormous debt problems that the United States still faces today. Invasion of Iraq. George Walker Bush announced the beginning of a global war on terrorism. At first, the main goal was the destruction of Al-Qaeda and its leader Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. But 2 years later, the White House began preparing a new campaign against Iraq. The Bush administration claimed that the regime of Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and could pose a threat to the United States and the entire world. These claims were based on questionable intelligence, but they were actively used to persuade Congress and the international community. In March 2003, American forces, together with allies, began the invasion of Iraq. The initial operation went quickly. The Hussein regime fell within a few weeks. However, instead of stability, the country fell into chaos. There were mass riots, attacks, and a civil war between different religious groups. In the absence of control, radical groups emerged among them, the one that later became known as the Islamic State. No weapons of mass destruction were found in the country. This was a huge blow to the credibility of the American government. The world perceived the invasion as unfounded and illegal. Within the United States, more and more people began to question the reasons for the war and its true purpose. Failure in Syria. In 2013, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, faced a difficult choice. In Syria, a civil war was raging, and the regime of Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons against civilians. Obama had earlier warned that the use of chemical weapons would be a red line after which the United States would be forced to intervene. The world expected decisive action, but it never happened. The White House began to hesitate. Congress was not united, allies were reluctant to support a military operation, and public opinion in the United States opposed another war in the Middle East. In the end, Obama refused to strike Syria, agreeing to a Russian plan to destroy the Syrian chemical weapons. On paper, it looked like a diplomatic compromise. But in practice, the consequences were very different. Assad remained in power and the conflict escalated. Syria turned into an arena of struggle between major powers, and Russia, taking advantage of U.S. indecision, intervened in the war, strengthening its influence in the region. Obama's decision not to use force despite his own statements undermined trust in the United States among allies and showed opponents that Washington is not always ready to act even when its red lines are crossed. Trump. In 2017, Donald Trump became the 45th president of the United States, promising to drain the Washington swamp to end corruption, bureaucracy, and the political elite. His victory was a shock for many Americans and a symbol of a deep division in society. He came to power as an anti-system figure, and this image helped him gain the support of millions of voters. From the first months of his presidency, Trump pursued a policy that was very different from his predecessors. He actively used social media, especially Twitter, where he addressed his supporters directly, often bypassing official communication channels. His statements caused scandals and diplomatic crises, but at the same time strengthened his image as a straightforward leader. However, Trump's management style quickly led to chaos. He dismissed advisors and ministers immediately after public conflicts, ignored expert advice, and often contradicted his own official statements. Polarization in the country grew. Society split between those who adored him and those who saw him as a danger to democracy. The most critical moment came when Trump refused to accept the results of the 2020 presidential election. His accusations of fraud led to the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021, when a crowd of his supporters tried to disrupt the certification of the election results. The presidency of Donald Trump went down in history as a period of extreme division. It showed how vulnerable even the oldest democracy in the world can be when politics becomes a battle of emotions rather than ideas. Thank you for watching the video. Using these hints, you can find our other videos.